The morning Corrine Webb left Halifax for Toronto. She ironed her good blouse twice. The first time she got the collar wrong, smoothing out a crease that somehow became a different crease. And so she unplugged the iron and stood there in her small kitchen for a moment, laughing softly at herself, the way a woman laughs when she has lived long enough to find her own stubbornness amusing. She had turned 73 in April. Her hair was entirely silver now, cut close to her head the way she had worn it for the past decade. And the blouse she finally settled on was a deep burgundy that her daughter had sent her for Christmas 2 years running, before Corrine had finally admitted she liked it. She had been a school teacher for 38 years, elementary school, grades 2 through 4, in the same building on the east end of Dartmouth, where she herself had once sat in a child-sized chair and learned to read. She had retired 7 years ago, reluctantly, after her knees began to protest the standing, and her doctor began to make suggestions she had no intention of following unless absolutely necessary. The school had held a gathering in her honor that filled the gymnasium past capacity. Former students showed up as adults, some with children of their own, some with gray already in their own hair. All of them insisting on photographs and telling her stories she had mostly forgotten but received with a warmth that stayed with her for weeks afterward. She had raised her daughter alone in that same neighborhood, a fact she mentioned rarely and felt deeply, the way a person feels the things they are most proud of, not loudly, but like a persistent warmth somewhere behind the ribs. Zaria had been a serious child, curious in the particular way that made teachers nervous and parents quietly ecstatic, always asking questions that assumed the world had better answers than it had yet given. Corrine had worked 2 jobs through Zaria's high school years without ever letting on exactly how close the numbers were at the end of certain months. And Zaria had won a scholarship to the University of Toronto and left for Ontario at 18 with 2 suitcases and a composure that broke her mother's heart in the very best way. That had been 25 years ago. The world had done things since then that Corrine still had not entirely absorbed, though she was proud beyond the capacity of ordinary language to express it. Zaria had built something from nothing, the way only people who have truly known nothing seem to understand how to do. She had founded a technology company at 26 from a rented room in Kensington Market, scaled it into something that appeared on financial news broadcasts, and in the pages of publications Corrine kept stacked on her coffee table, their covers slightly worn from handling. She did not fully understand what the company did. Zaria had explained it patiently several times, and each time Corrine had nodded in the places that seemed to require nodding, and felt a love so enormous it had nowhere particular to go. What she understood was that her daughter had built it herself, had refused twice to sell it to people, offering numbers with more zeros than Corrine's mortgage, and had brought on 460 employees, a detail Zaria mentioned once, and then moved past quickly, the way she moved past most things that reflected well on herself. Corrine's flight landed at Toronto Pearson just before 10 in the morning. She had traveled with only a carry-on bag, a pale canvas tote she had owned since the early 90s, the straps softened with use. Inside were 3 days of clothing, folded with the precision of a woman who had packed school field trip bags for years. A paperback mystery she was 2/3 through. A small container of her sister's jerk seasoning she was bringing for Zaria's kitchen, and a zippered pouch holding her travel documents and her reading glasses in their hard case. She had done everything right. She always did. The arrivals level at Pearson was busy in the way airports are busy at mid-morning. Not frantic, but full. Rolling luggage, conversations in a dozen languages, the particular smell of recycled air and coffee from the concession stands. Corrine moved through it unhurriedly, her tote over one shoulder, her sensible shoes, finding the same steady rhythm her feet had kept on classroom floors for 4 decades. She was looking for the signage toward ground transit, where Zaria's driver was supposed to be waiting. She did not see the 2 men watching her from near the domestic screening corridor before they had already decided something. Officer Renwick was 36 years old, and had worked at Pearson for 6 years. He had a way of carrying himself that newer officers sometimes mistook for confidence. A settled certainty in the tilt of his shoulders that turned out, on closer examination, to be closer to impatience. He had developed, over those years, a habit of identifying what he called anomalies, though the anomalies he flagged tended to belong to the same profile in ways he had never once paused long enough to examine. Officer Duval was 29, 7 months into the position, and he deferred to Renwick with the specific eagerness of a young man who had not yet learned to distrust the certainty of the people above him. A general alert had circulated that morning through the security channel, a reported item of missing luggage somewhere in the domestic arrivals section. Dark canvas bag, medium-sized, an older woman, last seen near Gate C, that was the entirety of it. It should not have been enough for anything. Renwick read it differently. "Over there," he said to Duval, and Duval did not ask why, did not consider which element of the description had matched, did not do any of the things his training was meant to require before approaching a civilian for secondary screening. He simply followed. Corrine noticed them before they reached her. The way she had spent a lifetime noticing things. Quietly, without performance. With the patient attention of someone who had learned early that a room could change before it announced itself. She shifted her tote strap and continued walking, because there was no reason not to, because she had done nothing, because she was a 73-year-old retired schoolteacher on her way to see her daughter, and she had no reason in the world to expect anything other than a pleasant October morning. "Ma'am, stop right there, please." She stopped. She turned toward them with a composed, measured expression and said "Good morning" in the same tone she had once used to settle a room of restless 8-year-olds, calm without being cold, patient without being deferential. Renwick told her, without introduction, that she matched the description of an individual connected to a property report and that he needed her to accompany them for secondary screening. Corrine looked at him steadily and then asked, with perfect courtesy, what description that might be. Renwick did not answer. He restated the instruction. She went with them because refusing would have made no difference. And she understood that. She had always understood that. She went with them the way she had moved through dozens of rooms in her life where the rules she had followed exactly had not applied to her in exactly the way they were written. The secondary screening room was a small, fluorescent-lit space near the baggage claim corridor. There was a table, a camera mounted in the upper corner. Duval positioned himself near the open doorway in a stance that blocked it without technically closing it. Renwick asked her to place her bag on the table. She did. He asked her to open it. She did. He went through it without ceremony, setting each item down with a briskness that had nothing to do with procedure, and everything to do with the particular quality of authority that requires an audience to feel real. Her folded clothes, her paperback, her sister's seasoning in its small container, which he held up and turned over several times before setting down. Her travel documents, which he examined in a way that extended well past the time it would have taken to simply confirm they were valid. Her glasses case. "What's in this?" he said, holding up her zippered pouch. "My reading glasses," she said, "in the case inside." He opened the case. He looked at the glasses. He set it back down. "Where are you coming from?" "Halifax. You can see the boarding pass." "And the purpose of your visit?" "I'm here to see my daughter. She lives in the city." He wrote something on a clipboard. She could not see what. She had been standing for 11 minutes by that point, though no one had offered her a chair, and her knees, which had opinions about extended standing, were beginning to make themselves known. "I would like to sit down," she said quietly, "and I would like you to tell me specifically what you're looking for, because I'd like to help you find it so we can both get on with our morning." It was, by any fair measure, a reasonable thing to say. Renwick received it differently. Something in his expression shifted in a way that Duval, watching from the doorway, would later describe to investigators as a person arriving at a decision rather than discovering one. You don't get to set the terms of a security screening, Renwick said. I understand that, Corrine said. I'm asking for a chair and a reason. I don't believe either of those is unreasonable. He reached across the table and took her tote. Not the contents already spread across the surface, but the bag itself, pulled it toward him with a motion sudden enough to knock her glasses case to the floor. And when she reached down, reflexively to retrieve it, his hand caught her shoulder with a force that was not incidental, a force that sent her sideways into the edge of the table, and then she was on the floor. The camera in the upper corner recorded everything. She lay against the linoleum for several seconds, her palm pressed flat to the floor, breathing in the careful way of a person who has just absorbed a shock and is determining, deliberately, what her body intends to do next. A line of pain moved from her shoulder down into her arm. Her right knee, the one that had required a brace through her final years of teaching, had landed against the floor's edge. Duval stood in the doorway and did not move. A woman in a yellow service vest from one of the airline concessions had been passing in the corridor. She stopped. She looked through the open doorway at the woman on the floor and the two officers standing over her, and she took out her phone. Corrine said, from the floor, in a voice so steady, it was difficult to hear without feeling something shift in your chest. I would like to call my daughter now. She was not given her phone. The woman in the yellow vest was already dialing. Zaria Ankra had been awake since 5. This was not unusual. She ran on 4 to 6 hours of sleep and had since her mid-20s, not out of ambition in the performative sense, but because her mind had always operated on a schedule that ran slightly ahead of whatever clock was on the wall, and she had long since accepted this, rather than resisted it. By 9:30, she was in the executive lounge at Pearson's domestic terminal, seated across from her chief operating officer and a lawyer she had worked with for 11 years, reviewing the final terms of a technology partnership that had taken 14 months to negotiate. The window behind her looked out over the tarmac. A coffee sat at her elbow, barely touched. She was 43 years old. She had the particular stillness of someone who no longer needed a room's attention to feel secure within it, which was, perhaps, why rooms tended to give her their attention regardless. She had been on 3 national magazine covers in the past 2 years and did not own a single copy of any of them. What she kept on her desk, in her office on the 32nd floor of a building in Toronto's financial district, was a photograph of herself at 18. Standing outside the Halifax bus terminal with 2 suitcases, squinting into the sun, wearing the expression of a person who is frightened and refusing to let it be visible. Her mother had taken the photograph. Corrine had been crying behind the camera, though Zaria had not learned this until her mother mentioned it casually over the phone 20 years later, as if it were a detail she had simply neglected to share. Her phone rang at 9:47. The number was her personal line, which almost no one had. The name on the screen was one she placed after a moment. Ruth Ann Sparks, a friend of her mother's from the neighborhood in Dartmouth, a woman who had occasionally watched a young Zaria after school on evenings when Corrine worked late. She answered on the second ring. Your mother's flight landed over an hour ago, Ruth Ann said. She was supposed to call me when she got through to arrivals. She always calls. I've tried her 3 times and it keeps going to voicemail. Zaria was on her feet before Ruth Ann had finished the sentence. She excused herself from the table in 2 words, already moving toward the door, already calculating. Her mother's flight from Halifax arrived at Gate C in the domestic terminal. She was in the executive lounge, 2 levels up and 1 concourse over. She knew this terminal better than most. Her company had finalized a multi-year infrastructure partnership with the airport authority only the previous month, and she had walked these corridors in multiple site reviews over the past year. She knew the layout. She knew where the secondary screening rooms were. She turned left without needing to ask anyone. She heard her mother before she saw her. Not because Corrine was making noise, because she wasn't. Because the particular absence of her mother's voice in a room where her mother had every right to speak was something Zaria registered in the cavity of her chest, like a frequency calibrated specifically to her after 43 years. She stepped into the open doorway and saw her mother sitting on the floor, one hand pressed to her knee, her burgundy blouse shifted off one shoulder, a scatter of her belongings across the table above her. Renwick was standing 2 feet away. Duval remained near the door. Neither of them had helped her up. What Zaria did next was not what anyone who had only ever seen her in conference rooms or on broadcast panels might have expected. She crossed the floor in 4 steps and crouched beside her mother, not as a CEO, not as anything with a title attached to it, but as a daughter who had needed her mother to always be all right and was discovering in real time the specific fear of confronting the limits of that need. She took her mother's hand. She looked at her face. The careful composure there, the stillness, Corrine maintained the way she had maintained it through parent meetings gone sideways and school board hearings and every room in her life that had required her to choose between her dignity and someone else's comfort. The stillness of a woman who had long since decided which one she would always choose. "Mama," she said very quietly, "are you hurt?" "My knee," Corrine said, "and my shoulder. I'm all right." "You're not all right," Zaria said, and the gentleness of it made the woman in the yellow vest, still standing in the corridor, press her hand over her own mouth. Zaria helped her mother stand slowly, steadying her with both hands, drawing her carefully toward the chair that no one had offered, and settled her into it. She wrapped her own blazer around her mother's shoulders, the way her mother had once wrapped a school coat around a small child at a cold bus stop, and then she stood. She turned around. "Which one of you put your hands on her?" she said. Her voice was entirely level, not raised, not shaking. The kind of quiet that is not the absence of anger, but the complete, deliberate governance of it. Renwick straightened his posture out of reflex. "Ma'am, this is a secure." "I heard you," Zaria said. "I asked which one of you put your hands on my mother." Duval said nothing. He was looking at the floor, and the part of him that had not yet been entirely shaped into something he could not walk back seemed to understand that whatever was occurring in this room had moved well beyond anything he knew how to correct. Zaria took out her phone. She did not explain what she was doing. She made a call that lasted 20 seconds, spoke a series of identifiers in a tone so flat it might have belonged to a machine, and ended the call. Renwick moved to issue another instruction. He did not complete it. The first to arrive was the airport's senior security director, a man named Fairfax, who had been in a contractor review meeting on the 3rd floor and arrived with his lanyard still swinging against his chest from having run. He stopped at the doorway and took in the room. Corrine in the chair, with Zaria's blazer across her shoulders. Zaria standing in the center of the space. The 2 officers arranged near the table with the scattered belongings between them. And the color left his face in a way that was visible even under fluorescent light. "Mrs. Ancra," he said. Renwick turned. He looked at Fairfax. He looked at Zaria. Something rearranged itself behind his eyes with a slowness that had nothing merciful about it. Fairfax crossed the room and stopped not in front of Zaria, but in front of Corrine. "Ma'am," he said, "I am deeply sorry, genuinely and completely sorry." Corrine looked at him with the same patient expression she had maintained throughout the entire encounter, the expression that had cost her something to hold and that she had held anyway. "My belongings are on that table," she said. "My knee needs ice, and I would like to see the report these officers say they acted on, because I would like to read it." The airport's general manager arrived 6 minutes later. She came through the corridor at a pace that made her assistant half jog to keep up, and when she reached the doorway, her first words were directed at the senior security director and contained language she did not generally use in public corridors. Renwick and Duval were asked to surrender their lanyards before they left the room. They did not speak on the way out. Duval paused for a fraction of a second at the door, as though he intended to say something, and then did not, and walked. What happened in the days that followed moved through the country with the particular velocity of a story that should not have needed to be told, but that too many people recognized in their bodies, in their accumulated history, to be able to turn away from. The camera footage from the secondary screening room was reviewed by the airport authorities' internal team within hours of the incident. It was not ambiguous. It showed an elderly woman cooperating fully at every stage of the encounter. It showed her requesting a reason twice and receiving none. It showed the moment the bag was seized, the stumble, the fall, the 11 minutes during which she sat on the floor of a public facility while two officers remained standing over her, and it showed the complete absence of any effort by either man to assist her. The general manager released a statement the following morning that contained no qualifications and no language designed to distribute responsibility across passive structures. The airport authority took full accountability. The officers had been suspended pending formal investigation. The woman who had been harmed deserved better than what she had received in that room, and the word deserved appeared in the statement 3 times, which several observers noted was unusual for institutional communications of that nature. Renwick and Duval were terminated before the end of the week. Their files were forwarded to the relevant regulatory body for review of conduct that the authorities' internal report described, in precise and careful language, as a failure at every decision point. From the initial approach through the room to the 11 minutes that followed the fall, the story reached national broadcast coverage on the second day. It arrived in living rooms and around kitchen tables in every province. And the responses that came through the airport authorities' public channels reflected something beyond ordinary outrage, a recognition that resonated especially among Black women of a certain generation, among their children and grandchildren, among anyone who had ever stood in a room not designed with them in mind and been required to remain composed while someone in a position of authority decided what they were worth. Zaria declined every interview request. She declined through her communications team. And then, when a journalist appeared in the lobby of her building, she declined in person with a directness that was not unkind but was absolutely final. She was not interested in becoming the story. She had never been interested in that. She was interested in getting her mother's knee properly evaluated, getting her settled on the balcony with tea and her paperback, and ensuring that the pale canvas tote, its contents repacked by Corrine herself with characteristic precision, was within easy reach. Corrine, for her part, was not silent. She had never been the kind of woman who mistook silence for composure. She had spent 38 years teaching children that questions deserved answers and that the absence of an answer was itself a kind of answer. And she applied that same understanding to the days that followed. She gave one interview on her own terms to a journalist from a Black Canadian publication based in Toronto, whose work she had been reading and respecting for years. She spoke for just over 40 minutes. She cried twice and did not apologize for it. She described the feel of the linoleum floor beneath her palm, the particular quality of the fluorescent light above her, the texture of the silence in that room while she waited for someone to help her up, and no one did. She described the 38 years that came before that morning. The classroom, the children, the neighborhood in Dartmouth, the daughter she had raised in a house where working 2 jobs was never called hardship because it was simply what that particular life asked of her. And she had answered. She described the burgundy blouse, ironed twice, the jerk seasoning wrapped carefully in a plastic bag, the paperback she had been hoping to finish on the return flight home. She did not say that she had forgiven the men who did this. She did not say that she had not. What she said, and what the journalist printed in full, was that she had made a decision a long time ago not to carry hatred for people whose behavior toward her was rooted in fear, because fear that becomes hatred requires you to give those people a permanent address inside yourself, and she needed that space for other things. I have been in harder rooms than that one, she said, and the reason I have always walked out of them is that I decided, before I ever walked in, that nothing inside would change what I already knew about myself. The response to the interview was significant enough that the publication's servers briefly slowed under the volume. Letters arrived at their offices and were forwarded in batches to Zaria's business address because no one had Corrine's address in Toronto, and she was, most days that week, on Zaria's balcony with her tea and her book, and the October light coming through the glass in long pale strips, healing. She read every single letter, all of them. The week before she flew home to Halifax, Corrine met with the airport authority's general manager and the head of their passenger experience division in a conference room that smelled of coffee and recently made decisions. She had brought a handwritten list. She was not a woman who typed when she could write by hand, and the list ran to 2 pages in the small, clear script she had developed over 4 decades of writing things on chalkboards for children to read from the back of the room. What she proposed was not complicated. She had been a teacher for 38 years. She thought like a teacher. She believed that the problem was not simply that 2 men had behaved badly in a screening room on a Tuesday morning. She believed the problem was structural, that people were permitted to carry assumptions into positions of authority over other people without those assumptions ever being examined by anyone with the standing to hold them accountable. She proposed a community consultation process, mandatory and recurring, staffed by representatives from the communities most affected by security profiling, that would inform the hiring, training, and conduct review practices of every contracted security operation at the airport. Not a one-time session presented as reform, a permanent feature of how the airport authority understood its obligations to the public it existed to serve. She had done her research the way she had always done research, thoroughly and without patience for the argument that something had always been done a certain way. The general manager listened without interrupting. She asked 4 questions. She accepted Corrine's list with both hands. The framework was formally adopted 4 months later. The airport authority named it the Webb Consultation Framework, a name Corrine had not sought and accepted with the same brief, unhurried grace with which she had always received recognition, as something to acknowledge and then move past quickly, because there was always more to do. On a Saturday evening in late October, 6 weeks after everything had started, Zaria drove her mother to Pearson for her flight back to Halifax. She walked her to the departure's entrance and stood with her at the point where the queue began, and for a moment neither of them said anything, because there was a great deal that could be said, and neither of them had ever required words to fill the space between them. "Next time," Zaria said, "I'll arrange for a car to bring you through directly." Corrine looked at her daughter with the expression of a woman who has spent 43 years watching a particular face and is still, in small moments, surprised by how much she loves it. "Next time," she said, "I'll take the train." Zaria laughed, a real one, the kind that caught her slightly off guard, the kind that had been in short for 6 weeks. Her mother watched her laugh with the expression of someone who has been collecting this specific image for decades and is still not finished adding to the collection. "You always come," Corrine said. It was not a question. "I always come," Zaria said. Corrine patted her daughter's cheek with one hand, the hand that had healed, and picked up her pale canvas tote with the softened straps, repacked the morning before, with the same burgundy blouse and the same paperback, and a second container of her sister's seasoning and everything she needed, plus a few things she was taking home that she had not arrived with. The letters, bound with an elastic band, that she intended to answer one by one at her kitchen table in Dartmouth, at the window that looked out over the street she had walked for 40 years. She joined the queue. She moved through it at her own pace, unhurried. The officer at the checkpoint, a young woman Corrine had not seen before, asked for her boarding pass and identification, reviewed them, and returned them with a small nod and a clear passageway ahead. Corrine walked through without looking back, not because what was behind her no longer mattered, but because she had always known. With the particular certainty of someone who has spent a lifetime walking through rooms not built with her in mind, that you keep moving forward, Not because the difficulty is over, but because you refuse, absolutely and completely, to let it be the thing that decides your direction. Zaria stood at the entrance until her mother disappeared into the terminal. She stood there a few seconds longer than necessary, watching the space her mother had just moved through, and then she turned and walked back to the car through the late October evening, the air already cold in the way that meant winter had made up its mind. And she felt, for the first time in 6 weeks, something that was not quite peace, but was close enough to it. The particular quiet that comes not from the absence of difficulty, but from knowing, with complete clarity, where you stand within it.